Talking with Jerry.
Okay, back with another episode. This one is going to be interesting. It's some commentary on something that I hope you had a chance to watch.
Yeah, enjoyed watching the Black Godfather series season on MGM channel, formerly Epic Channel, with Forrest Whitaker, who played the notorious Harlem gangster, Bumpy Johnson. But let's briefly discuss what's the truth and what was fiction in the series.
Well, we're both from Harlem, so we know some of the legendary stories about, old time gangsters, and then the gangsters of the big era in Harlem, drug era, which you might say was just like the 1970s. And of course, we know about the numbers business, which was the first era of gangsters in Harlem, which is the Black Mecca still for Black America. And of course, the numbers business, which was introduced by Black gangsters to white gangsters. There's a long story about how that happened, but that's how Bumpy Johnson got his original start, being an enforcer for Black people who were in the numbers business. And then, of course, the white people took over the numbers business, and then that propelled Bumpy Johnson's career. So then they didn't show that in the series. So I want to start off with talking about that for a quick minute, and then we'll go into what was really happening in the Black Godfather that was true and that was false. So it was an excellent series. Forrest Whitaker, he's a great actor. The series was produced by a producer who produced the show Narcos, which was on Netflix, which is excellent. But Bumpy Johnson got his career started in the numbers business, something that you don't hear about anymore. A lot of young people don't even know about it. But numbers was a very popular game in urban America, in the big cities, but especially in New York, where it got its start, where Black people who didn't have much money could bet a penny, a nickel, a dime, and make a couple of $100s, which was a lot of money in the 1930s and 40s. Or if they bet $5, they could win $3,000 if they picked these three numbers to come out correct. And the numbers were based on the winning horse that would win a race over the three races that would take place during the day. And these bookies would call in the number of the winning horse, and that's how you'd get these three numbers. So you could hit it straight, you could play to hit one number, or you could play a combination. So these, what we call Black gangsters, unlike what you would say a Black gangster of today, they really weren't in the drug trade. They were numbers men, they were businessmen, they dressed nice. They even fronted money for the Black community. They gave people loans, they owned the funeral parlors. And something that a lot of people don't know, if you've heard of Negro League Baseball, that was before Black men could play in Major League Baseball. Most of the teams in Negro League Baseball were all owned by numbers men, Black gangsters or policy men who were in that business. But what happened was, one day, people used to buy these dream books, and they had a dream, and they dream of a number, and they would play it. And a lot of people went and bet this one number. And so many people won that the Black numbers men, the Black bankers, as they were called, couldn't pull enough money together in Harlem amongst all of them to pay all of the people who won the number. They had no way to come up with $1 million or whatever overnight. There's so many people won this number. So they said the only thing we could do is go to the white gangsters. This is the beginning of the mafia. This is before there were five families. You had people like Dutch Schultz and all of the Irish gangsters, and there were Italian gangsters who were just coming up. And they said, we can go to them, borrow the money, and in a couple of days we'll pay them back, because who else is going to give us almost $1 million? So all the black gangsters, they call the Italian gangsters and Dutch Schultz, who was a German gangster, and they said, listen, we need to borrow X amount of money. We can pay you back in like 2 or 3 days. So they said, are you crazy? You can't pay us this money back. How could you get this type of money in 2 or 3 days? So they had to share with them that they had this thing called the policy numbers, that people would bet in Harlem, and they would bet their nickels and dimes and quarters, and if somebody had $1 or $2, this is, coming out of the Depression, so money was tight, and that it was very profitable. So they said, okay, we're going to give you this money, but if you don't pay us this money back by the end of the week, we're coming to kill all of you. Well, within about 2 or 3 days, they had made all the money back. They went to the white gangsters. They paid them all the money back. But unfortunately, because they showed their card and they showed the white gangsters how much money there was in the numbers business, the white gangsters who weren't in Harlem, though they were on the borders of Harlem, decided to come into Harlem and take over the numbers business. And a war erupted between the black gangsters and the Italian gangsters. And then the Irish gangsters got involved. The Dutch Schultz, who was a German gangster, they got involved. But of course, they all teamed up as white gangsters against the black gangsters. And that's kind of how Bumpy Johnson got his start. I don't want to get off track talking about what happened, but he befriended some of the Italian gangsters, and that's really not shown in The Black Godfather. I thought that really piece of history should have been shown as part of like a prelude, so you would know how Harlem was back before he got his start and when he first started to get into a life of crime. So it was unfortunate that was left out, and the series was great, but that was one thing that was true that they didn't cover.
So who were the true legends of heroin trafficking in New York City and Harlem?
Well, in the series, they spent a lot of time showing Bumpy Johnson, figuring out ways to get, as they called it, the Ducci, to get heroin from overseas, trying to make deals with the Italians to get it from them, but not directly have to give them back, but so much money, having to fight for control of Harlem, so he would be the only distributor of drugs. And most of that is all made up stories. Bumpy Johnson, yes, he was selling heroin, but small amounts. You'd be surprised to know, and you could look this up, the truth is that he got busted at a very famous hotel, the Teresa Hotel, and he only had a couple of bags of heroin on him, and that's how he ended up getting federal time and sent to Sing Sing. So he wasn't this dealer dealing with kilos of drugs. And in one of the episodes, they have him, setting up a network of black drug dealers all over the country, and he's the major distributor. That's all BS. Also, you saw in there where Bumpy Johnson is shown as if he's almost on par with the mafia. He's going to sit-downs. When they have major meetings of all the 5 families, he can just walk in and have a conversation with them. Total BS. To even as a black gangster, go and sit down with any member of the mafia, they're not going to respect you. And when they have their private meetings, you're not going to be there. And if the 5 families are meeting with Vito Genovese, who at that time was the head of the 5 families in New York, a black man is not going to walk in there to start talking with them about business. They didn't even talk to their own underlings. So that was totally false. Totally made up. And but it's a TV show, and they wanted to make him seem bigger than he was. Now, he did have a relationship with the Italians, as I said, coming out of the numbers business. And of course, at that time, to get heroin, any amount of heroin, you usually had to go to the Italians because they were the ones that had access to import it into the country. Now, there are some really crazy things that went on in the series that I want to touch on also that were totally untrue. And then I want to touch on something that was true, but the way they told it wasn't true, but it was really happening in another kind of way. These 2 points. So one is his relationship with Malcolm X. So you see in the series that he's buddy-buddy with Malcolm X. And if you know anything about Malcolm X, if you know anything about the Nation of Islam, you probably say to yourself, well, wait a minute. How could Malcolm X, who's this black nationalist, he sets up for Elijah Muhammad all these mosques all over the country, and he's radical, and he's going to, do these things to straighten out the black community, but he's friends with Bumpy Johnson, who's bringing all these drugs into Harlem. It doesn't make any sense. And you're right. It doesn't make any sense because it didn't happen. Bumpy Johnson knew Malcolm X from Malcolm X's days in Harlem as a petty gangster and petty thief. You'd also be surprised to know that Malcolm X, who was called Red, there was another guy named Red who was Malcolm X's buddy, who, if you watch the movie Malcolm X, they don't show you him in the movie that Spike Lee made. And Malcolm X's friend and running buddy was a guy named Red Fox. Yeah, the comedian, Red Fox, who, from Stanford and Son, he used to be a gangster, a criminal back in the day and run with Malcolm X. But anyway, that's when Bumpy Johnson knew Malcolm X, when he was a criminal, a petty criminal. And then, from the movie, Malcolm X gets arrested, he goes to jail, he gets kind of almost strung out on drugs. He joins the Nation of Islam. It transforms his life. Now, Malcolm would not have then come to Harlem in Mosque number 7. He's building the Nation of Islam, and he's going to have a relationship with Bumpy Johnson, who's bringing all these drugs into Harlem, killing people. Of course, it makes no sense. So Malcolm, with his integrity, would have never had a relationship with Bumpy Johnson like that, as Bumpy Johnson would have been flooding Harlem with drugs. That's just not true. So that's something else that I wanted to point out.
Well said. In the series, the CIA is portrayed in many episodes by a rogue agent who gets involved with trying to kill Malcolm X, Fidel Castro, and bring drugs into Harlem. What was accurate about these depictions?
Well, that's a very good question. Now, the CIA is the Central Intelligence Agency. It's a government agency. And by its statute and by American law, technically, they're not supposed to operate in the United States. The Central Intelligence Agency is only supposed to do things outside of the United States. But they're the CIA. And I'm going to tell you a true story in a minute, so you'll see how they get involved in doing things even in the United States. But the answer to that question is, the fact of the matter, the CIA was involved heavily in putting drugs into the black community, not just in Harlem, but all over the country. And I can fast forward to the crack epidemic, to hearings that happened, and I'm going to get to that, with Freeway Ricky Ross out in LA and the CIA's involvement in bringing drugs into South Central Los Angeles. But we want to stick with Bumpy Johnson. So in the series, there's this CIA agent, and he's all over the place. He's got assignments to kill Castro. He's working with the Cubans to invade Cuba. And then, of course, they need funding, and one of the ways to do it is with heroin, and they can raise money. And that gets into what I'm going to talk about with crack later, how they took something that was true and put it into the series, but it was predated because they're making it seem like it was heroin. But let's go back to with Bumpy Johnson. So when Bumpy Johnson was involved with heroin, what you might not know is that there wasn't a big demand for heroin at that time. There weren't a lot of people using heroin. You had mostly jazz musicians. You had a few people that experimented with it. They got strung out. But in the 50s, the 40s, even the early 60s, there was not a lot of drug addicts all over Harlem or all over New York City. It was a very small group of people using heroin. Not until we got into the 70s did it really explode. And by then, Bumpy Johnson was basically over. He was, in a few years, he would soon be dead. But the two big heroin dealers were a guy named Nikki, who you've probably heard of, and another guy that you probably did not know about, and his name was Frank Matthews. Now, you may have heard of Frank Lucas, who from the movie American Gangster with Denzel Washington, yes, he was a true individual, but in that movie was a lot of BS too, because he was not as big a heroin dealer as they made him seem in the movie. Yes, he had connections to bring in drugs from South Vietnam, but as people who were in the council with Nicky Barnes and a guy named Freddie Myers, who I knew New York Freddie Myers would say in some interviews when he got out of prison, well, Frank Lucas didn't have any streets. So he had some heroin, he had drugs, but he had no way to sell it, no way to distribute it, because we controlled the streets, meaning Nicky Barnes, meaning New York Freddie. They had the workers on the street who could sell the drugs to the individuals that were lining up every day who were strung out on heroin. So, Frank Lucas, he had access to a lot of heroin. He had some projects over in New Jersey, and I'm sure he dealt with people in other parts of the country, but he was not as big as Nicky Barnes, who I'm sure that you have heard of, who was over something called The Council. And actually, there's a movie being produced by Will Smith's production company by someone I know that is a writer, television writer, who's working with one of the members of The Council to produce this with Will Smith's production company for Netflix. So you'll see a whole true story about Nicky Barnes and his rise to fame. But the other person, and this ties in with the CIA, is Frank Matthews. Now, Frank Matthews, he had some street dealers, some in Harlem, some in Brooklyn, but Frank Matthews was the first big black dealer that not only had distributors all over the country, but also was one of the first to only deal in large amounts of heroin that he himself was importing from overseas. Now, Frank Matthews, by unfortunate luck, every Sunday, guys would come in from all over the country, Baltimore, DC, Philadelphia, because you had the Philadelphia Black Mafia, which was very prominent then. And these guys would come to his house, and he would have kilos of heroin that he would give them, and then they would take it back to their city, sell it. The next Sunday, come back, bring him the cash, and they would re-up and get other kilos to go back to their cities. Well, one of the Sundays, a detective noticed that there's all these luxury cars, Cadillacs, Lincoln Continentals, and they have all these different license plates from all over the country, and he thought it was kind of odd. Well, the next Sunday, he sees the same thing. So he starts to investigate, and that's how an investigation opened up about Frank Matthews. And what happens is the DEA, the federal agency, which is over drug enforcement, along with the NYPD, opens an investigation on Frank Matthews. They're following him, blah, blah, blah. They eventually arrest him. And he puts up several $1 million in bail, which they didn't think he was going to be able to do. Now, he had so much money. There was someone that I know whose brother was one of his lieutenants, that in one instance, he got into a situation and he told a person, listen, take this bag of money and hold this for me. I'll get it back from you because I got to go do something. I don't want to have all this money with me. So the guy never counted the money, and he just went about his business. So it was a month or two later, and he's with Frank Matthews, and he says, hey, you gave me a bag of money to hold for you. Don't you want it back? And he said, oh yeah, I forgot. There's $3 million in that bag. And that's, the type of money he was dealing with. There's another instance, and this is on YouTube, where someone who worked with him talked about how he had an apartment. No, this was a house up in Westchester County, and he came up to bring Frank Matthews a duffel bag full of money, and he was busy doing something else. So when he came in the house, he said, oh, just open up that closet and throw it in there. And when the guy opened up the closet, it was filled with duffel bags of money. That's the type of money that this guy had. So he gets arrested, he gets out on bail. Now, the New York City Police Department, right, and the DEA are going to move forward with prosecuting him, though he's out on bail. One day, the lead detective gets a call, and it's the DEA, and they say, listen, we got a call that we have to go down to Washington, to headquarters in Washington, D.C. Our boss has summoned us, and you have to come with us. I don't know what it's about. It is about the Frank Matthews case, but what they want to talk to us about, I have no idea. Now you say, what does this have to do with Bumpy Johnson? Because I'm getting to something with the CIA that is truthful, it's factual, it's on YouTube with the detectives and other people who are involved in this case who talk about this. So they go down to Washington, D.C., and when they get to the DEA headquarters, the head of the DEA is there, and they're in this small conference room, and these two other guys come into the room. So the head of the DEA says to the NYPD detectives and to his two DEA agents, this Frank Matthews case, it has to go away. And they said, well, what are you talking about? We've been pursuing this. We got this guy red-handed. And he turns to the two men who just came into the room, and they start talking. And they said, gentlemen, we are Agent so-and-so and Agent so-and-so. We're from the CIA. And this case, I'm just paraphrasing now, has to go away because Frank Matthews does business with people that we are kind of in business with in South America. And that's where he's getting his drugs from. And these people in South America need to make money because it's a way of them generating money to fight communism in South America. And part of what our missions are is to stop, this is in the late 1960s, to spread communism from spreading around the world. And it's spreading throughout Latin America. And these friends of ours are ex-Nazis who fled Germany after World War II. And as one of the ways of making money illegally, they went into the drug trade. They are, as you would say now, the plug for Frank Matthews. That's who he gets his heroin from. And they didn't say it outright, but basically, so what if it's going into Harlem and killing a bunch of niggas? These guys got to make money. We got to stop communism from spreading all over the world. And guess what? You're going to leave Frank Matthews alone. So the agents were very upset. And the short of that story is Frank Matthews never showed up back to court. He disappeared off the face of the earth. Now, people who are his associates said he took, however much millions of dollars he had. He disappeared. No one ever saw him again. Some people said he was spotted in Africa. Some people said he was spotted in the Caribbean. By now, he's probably dead. He's been dead. Just like Nikki Barnes, who I talked about, who became a government witness against his own counsel and many mafia members in the Italian mafia. People didn't even know he was out of jail. And he was living in Ohio, had a car wash, and had been dead over 12 years before the federal government announced that he had been out of jail and dead. So that's a story about Frank Matthews, a true story, and how the CIA looked the other way as heroin was coming into New York City, flooding the streets of Harlem. And Frank Matthews was distributing these drugs to other major black drug dealers around the country. So that part of the Black Godfather was true, and they probably took some of those stories and just made it seem as if Bumpy Johnson was involved in that, when in actuality, he wasn't involved in that. Now, the last thing that I want to mention about this series, once again, gets back to Malcolm X. And you see in the series that Bumpy Johnson, at one point, when the word is getting out, when Malcolm leaves the Nation of Islam, there are some things that transpire.
Bumpy Johnson was portrayed as protecting Malcolm X. Did he really know Malcolm, and was that a true depiction of what happened? You counseled one of the killers of Malcolm X, so give us some factual insight.
Sure. So now, Malcolm had people with him that left the Nation of Islam, that were in the FOI, which was the Fruit of Islam, this the security apparatus in the Nation of Islam. And these people served as Malcolm's bodyguard. But also with Malcolm X was a New York City undercover police officer. And if you look at photographs, which I'm going to show, of when Malcolm is killed at the Audubon Ballroom, there's someone standing over him, even though the guy knew that Malcolm was dead, and he couldn't compress his chest to try to, get him, to see if he was still alive or do anything. It appears he's doing that. But that gentleman was actually a New York City police officer that was undercover agent acting as if he was down with Malcolm X. But in the series, when they show Bumpy Johnson sending his henchmen to guard Malcolm as if they would have been able to protect Malcolm against the nation, that was all basically untrue. And the nation at this time was powerful, was at its peak. I'm going to play a little recording of when Malcolm was interviewed by the FBI, and you'll hear his integrity, how, he talked to the agents and wouldn't give up any information. But more importantly, the fear that the Nation of Islam had, even over the mafia itself. I'm going to share two quick stories and we're going to wrap up. So here's one. Back in that era, the Nation of Islam was making a lot of money through their restaurants that they owned around the country called Steak and Take. And they had these restaurants where they would serve these steak sandwiches. But another thing that the nation did to raise a lot of money was the brothers, besides selling newspapers, sold fish. They had fish coming in from overseas, and they would on the Saturdays go out to the projects all over the community and sell this fresh fish. Well, not only on Saturdays, on Fridays too, of course, because back in that time period, many people ate fish on Friday. Well, in New York City, at one point, the docks, and I have a lot of experience this, they were controlled by the mafia and by a group of Irish gangsters called the Westies. And the docks where the ships came in, even to this day, where the Port Authority of New York, where the cruise ships go in and out, that's controlled. Well, one of the ships came in that brought in fish that the Nation of Islam brothers were supposed to pick up from Mosque number 7 in Harlem. And when they got down there late in the day with the truck, the gangsters basically told him, well, you got to come back tomorrow, and we ain't unloading this today. There's a little bit of racism there. And so one of the brothers said, listen, we need to get our fish today, and we need you to go on that ship and offload the fish, and we'll put it in our trucks, and we're going to go about our business. Well, a bunch of guys, these guys were tough. They came from off the docks, and they said, well, we ain't offloading nothing, blah, 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 and they just stood firm. So the brother goes to a payphone. There's no cell phones then. He calls uptown to Mosque number 7, and they sent down about 75 brothers. And they said, either you're going to unload that ship, or we're going to board that ship, and we'll unload it ourselves, and you ain't going to do nothing. And what happened was their foreman looked at the stevedores and the guys that were there, and they said, unload the ship, because they were scared of the brothers from the Nation of Islam. So they were feared. Now, I'll tell you one more true story. There used to be a magazine called Look magazine, which was a competitor to Life magazine, and it came out every week. And back then, everybody read Look magazine, Life magazine, and if you were black, you read Ebony magazine. Well, Look magazine did a story about a report from the FBI about a beef between the Nation of Islam and the mafia in New York City, something that really could have involved all 5 mafia families. Well, what happened was a captain in Mosque number 7 in Harlem, who was in the FOI, who was into the martial arts. During his day job, he was a construction worker. And on one of these construction sites, he was just like a laborer. He had some words with a young Italian guy who was like a supervisor, and they got into a beef, and he beat the crap out of him, like broke his nose, like broke his arm. He beat the crap out of him. So this guy who's in the Nation of Islam, he doesn't think anything. He's fearless. He comes back to work the next day. So now the Italians who run construction in New York, the guys are like, yo, you have the nerve to show up to work? You might get your ass killed out here. And he said, ain't nobody gonna hurt me. I'm punching in, I'm doing my job. So blah, blah, blah. Anyway, in a wiretap, the FBI overhears that the guy who was beat up was the son of one of the capo regimes of one of the 5 mafia families. And when he finds out that his son had been beat up so bad, he gets some of his hitmen, and they're going to go to the construction site and kill this guy in the Nation of Islam. Well, he gets word of it, and once again, he says, ain't nobody going to hurt me. He comes back to the construction site with a bunch of brothers from uptown, from the Nation. He's fearless. And they say if a hair on his head is harmed, there's going to be hell to pay. So the capo di regime in the mafia, then he's a little scared to really just go kill this guy, though he wants to send hitmen even up to Harlem to kill him. So he goes to the head of his family in the mafia and says, listen, I got this beef. This guy beat up my son. And this guy is in this Nation of Islam with this Malcolm X and all this stuff. I don't care. He's got to go, blah, blah, blah. So they said, well, we don't want to really just go and do something. Let me talk to the other families to see what's going on. So the head of all the mafia families in New York City convene about this. And Vito Genovese, who you see is portrayed in the Black Godfather, tells the head of all the mafia families in New York City, we do not want a war with the Nation of Islam. Yeah, we could kill this guy, but then we're going to have to kill all of them. And these guys believe in Allah. They believe in Malcolm X. They believe in this Elijah Muhammad. And there's thousands of them. And they'll come from Chicago. And they'll come from Philadelphia. And the business of the five families is to make money. And your son just got his ass kicked, and that's going to be the end of it. So that tells you the type of fear that the FOI and the Nation of Islam had at that time. So in closing, to answer, would Bumpy Johnson have been able to protect Malcolm X? The answer is no. As you know, Malcolm X was killed at the Audubon Ballroom. The killers came out of the Newark Mosque. Two of the people who were arrested out of Mosque number 7 in Harlem were not the actual killers. I did counsel one of the actual killers, who was the only one who was incarcerated for the killing of Malcolm X, but who at the time I did not know who he was, because they didn't disclose that to me until my last day working with him for security reasons. But when the killing of Malcolm X happened, Bumpy Johnson was kind of, still a noted gangster, but the Nation of Islam was so feared, so strong, it would have been hard for anybody to protect Malcolm. And the government itself, the United States government, was involved in the assassination of Malcolm X by planting seeds among members of the Nation of Islam that Malcolm X was a traitor to the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And also, the day that Malcolm was killed, 2 of his most trusted bodyguards, and this is portrayed in the Black Godfather, where they show Bumpy's guys are pulled over by federal agents and told they're under arrest. But in real life, federal agents pulled over 2 of Malcolm's security guys and arrested them and said that they were planning to blow up the Statue of Liberty. So they couldn't be there that day to guard Malcolm X. And one of them was supposed to be on the door searching everybody to make sure that no one came in with a firearm. Because if he was there, those 3 killers who came in with a shotgun and 2 handguns would have never got in that door. But the government, the U.S. government, knew what they were doing by arresting those guys. And even there that day, as I said, standing over Malcolm when he's killed is a New York City police officer. There was also other New York City police officers outside. They didn't rush upstairs. And for years, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI knew who the real killer was. And if you watch the documentary on Netflix about who the real killers of Malcolm X were, you saw how he was able to expose that. So those are just some facts on the Black Godfather. I hope you enjoy learning some truth about what was fact, what was fiction, and look forward to sharing things with you in the future. Don't forget to subscribe.